We wear no mark. We belong to every class. We permeate every class of the community from the highest to the lowest. And so you see, in the Women's Civil War, the dear men of my country are discovering it is absolutely impossible to deal with it. You cannot locate it and you cannot stop it.
I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough.
This is no simple reform. It really is a revolution. Sex and race, because they are easy, visible differences, have been the primary ways of organizing human beings into superior and inferior groups, and into the cheap labor on which this system still depends. We are talking about a society in which there will be no roles other than those chosen or those earned. We are really talking about humanism.
Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low?
Society has identified and capitalized on the differences of people. They have used those differences to discriminate and to oppress. Discrimination has been ingrained in society for so long that there is no solution, only progress. As each generation attempts to make more progress and overcome barriers, they pave the way for a better, more equal future. Each step of progression on the road to equality is a triumph in itself. Oftentimes, each step is punished with 2 steps backward. The tragedy of creating change means that those who dedicated their lives to progress never get to see the triumph they contributed to. Nevertheless, the story of equality and opportunity continue on in a cycle of triumphs and tragedies that will one day result in an equal society. The 20th century witnessed both the progression and regression of women in the workplace, beginning with the triumph of women working during World War II and the tragedy of being forced back into domestic roles in the 1950s. The 19th century saw a dynamic change in the way women and society viewed gender roles. Beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, the suffrage movement took root. The suffrage movement was motivated by the expansion of voting rights to all white men. Although the fight for women's suffrage would ultimately result in a triumph in 1920, tragically, advocates would never witness the fruits of their labor. The greatest progress and triumph for women's rights and equality occurred in the 20th century. Nearly 100 years after the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, women finally earned the right to vote. This began the integration of women into the workplace and the changing of society's expectations. The First World War provided women with more opportunities outside the household, including factory work and military service as nurses. Although the First World War provided more opportunities for women, the triumph was short-lived. The men returned and reassumed the roles that women had filled during the war. The nation was shocked on December 7, 1941, by the tragedy known as Pearl Harbor.
A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
From the ashes of tragedy rose the triumph of the American people. As the country rushed to join the war, the American people rose to the challenge. Men hurried to enlist and were shipped off to Europe to fight in the Second World War. Their abrupt departure left a void in the factories. A role that had been dominated by men was not just available for women, but necessary. Propaganda encouraged women to join the war effort. The iconic Rosie the Riveter represented the women who worked in factories and shipyards. The poster depicted a new role for women, as well as new clothes that were contradictory to the traditional clothes women wore. During the war, 37% of adult women moved outside the household and became employed. Women comprised 36.1% of the civilian workforce. Women's contribution to the war effort allowed the United States to dominate. The manufactured goods produced were able to ensure that the United States was properly equipped. Production during the war increased substantially, with B-24 Liberators coming off the line in 63 minutes. World War II also saw 350,000 women serve in the military. The advocacy of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt led General George Marshall to support the idea of creating a service branch for women in the Army. In 1942, Congress added the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which became known as the Women's Army Corps. Members were known as WACs, and by 1945 there were more than 1,000. The Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps also followed the Army's lead and created women's branches. In addition to the roles women played in the manufacturing and military sectors of the war, women also flew military aircrafts. These women, known as WASPs, or Women's Air Force Service Pilots, were already licensed pilots. More than 1,000 women served as WASPs. These pilots ferried planes from factories to bases, transported cargo, and participated in strafing and target mission simulations. During the war, the WASPs flew more than 60 million total miles. Additionally, by undertaking these roles during the war, thousands of male pilots were able to serve in active duty. Despite the WASP's contribution to the triumph of the United States in the Second World War, the women were not given official military status. Tragically, 38 women lost their lives during the war. Without any military status, the pilots did not receive any military honors or benefits. It wasn't until 1977 that the WASPs were finally given full military status. Then it was another 33 years before the pilots received proper recognition. In 2010, the WASPs were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. The triumph of new roles and opportunities for women experienced during World War II was met with a harsh reality upon the return of the soldiers. A once integral part of factory work, women were thrust back into their previous domestic roles. Although the employment rates stayed higher than the employment rates before the war, women still saw a decline in the positions available to them. Between 61 to 85% of women surveyed by polls wanted to keep their jobs after the war. Despite that, women were often laid off from their jobs when men returned. The employment rate from women dropped to 33.9% in 1950. Additionally, women were paid less than men in the same jobs, which is a problem that continues to persist in the workplace. As demonstrated by the WASPs, women also did not receive the proper recognition of their contribution to the war. The 1950s saw a dramatic change in the portrayal and treatment of women, particularly in media. Posters that read, "How to be a good wife," and that depicted women in household roles were in sharp contrast to the strong women represented during World War II. Companies advertised their products by emphasizing a strong patriarchal structure within the home. This often left women represented as subservient to men. Although the 1950s saw the reversal of women's roles as compared to women during World War II, the short-term tragedy led to the overall expansion of women's roles in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Women continued to advocate for their rights and expand their opportunities outside the household. Since the drop in employment in the 1950s, there's been a steady growth of female employment outside the household. Additionally, women were able to secure better opportunities to go to college. The story of women's quest for rights and equality has been filled with remarkable triumphs and bitter tragedies. The expansion of women's roles and opportunities during World War II was a step in the right direction. The United States was able to capitalize on an untapped reserve of workers by expanding employment opportunities. Women's contribution undoubtedly aided the United States' triumph. Although the women of the war tragically did not receive all of the honor and recognition they deserved, they began a growing trend of women's employment. World War II and the subsequent 1950s were examples of the tragedies and triumphs faced by women.
Whatever you choose, however many roads you travel, I hope that you choose not to be a lady. I hope you will find some way to break the rules and make a little trouble out there. And I hope you'll choose to make some of that trouble on behalf of women.
One message that echoes forth from this conference. Let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.